For the fifth part of this lecture set, we'll talk about organization and memorizing. So some of the benefits of organization. So we've already seen that the greater the degree of internal organization we have in our memories, the easier it is to recall at a later date. The internal organization here just refers to the degree of connections between different concepts and knowledge that we have stored in our brain. The more connections that we have between different items to be remembered, the easier those tend to be to remember and the more reliably they are remembered. Now, another way that this organization can help us is actually by applying organization to the material that we're trying to learn. Because the more and more we're able to impose some organizational structure on material to be learned, the easier it is to learn this new material. Now, strategies that are used oftentimes to impose this type of organization are called mnemonics. You'll find hundreds and hundreds of different types of mnemonics depending on the types of fields you are in. And it is ultimately a technique designed to improve memory accuracy and make learning easier. And in most cases, mnemonic strategies will apply or impose some type of organization onto the material that is to be learned. Now, we won't go into all of them, but here are 3 different ones that are mentioned in your textbook and might be helpful if you ever need to memorize a list of things. So the first is probably one most people are familiar with, and this is just you take the first letters of the sequence of things you're trying to remember and you organize those into some kind of meaningful structure, which you can then use to cue your memory for what those original items were. So something many people are familiar with is PEMDAS, and we can say PEMDAS and it ultimately gives us a reminder for the fact that parentheses are operated on before exponents, which are operated on before multiplication, then division, addition, and subtraction. I think another one of this is the rainbow, Roigi Biv or something gets used here a lot. Another one that I thought was adorable is King Philip crosses the ocean to find good spaghetti, and this refers to the various biological classifications of animal or species in general, I guess. And this goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Like we are Homo sapiens of the genus Hominum. Anyway, another way in which one can improve memory is by taking the different items that are to be remembered and linking them together in some visual mental imagery, where you basically put them in your mind's space and you make them interact in some way. And the richer they interact, the easier it is to remember. So for example, if 2 of the items that one is needing to remember are eagle and train, then you could imagine either a train running over an eagle, as weird as that would be, or an eagle picking up a train and flying away with it. Now, in many ways, it's been shown that the more outrageous these images are, the easier it will be to remember them later on. And further, if the items are not actually interacting in some way in this mental space, they don't actually confer any benefit to remembering. So if the various items are just sitting side by side in your mental space, it won't confer any benefits to remembering. The third, and maybe the most useful here actually, are word peg systems. And word peg systems work sort of as a combination of applying some kind of ordered structure along with mental images. And so here one takes a list or a sort of a step-by-step a piece of knowledge that one has, like a rhyme or a song or something to that effect, and then one ties new items that are to be remembered to this existing list. And oftentimes one ties them to the existing list with the help of mental images. And so there's this rhyme that is given in your textbook where it's something like 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, and it goes on. And so ideally you would know this rhyme backwards and forwards. It's just kind of one thing that you could say with your eyes closed after 4 beers and you're like, yeah, this is totally easy for me. And then what you do is, if I have to say, okay, I have to pick up toothpaste, I would imagine a relationship between toothpaste and bun. And so like buns could be kind of like donuts, but filled with toothpaste, they would be pretty gnarly. And then maybe the next one I have to remember is, okay, I also have to get a brush. And so I can use brushes to clean shoes, and it would just look kind of funny to use a toothbrush to clean a shoe. And so I build this pairing, And so then all I have to do when I'm actually at the store is recite my little rhyme here where I'm like, one is a bun, ooh, toothpaste. Two is a shoe, ooh, I need a toothbrush. Because you've now associated these two together, and thus if everyone forgets an item on the list, all one has to do is sort of mentally rehearse this ordered sequence to call to mind these other pieces of information. Because ultimately what one is doing is building connections between the new items in this existing list. Thus, rehearsing the list ultimately elicits those connections and activity passing down them. Now, mnemonics can be incredibly useful for remembering lists of items. I mean, they are actually unbelievably effective. Now, there are some downsides to using mnemonics as well. And so typically speaking, mnemonics organize material in a way that focuses really on a specific subset of the items to be remembered. So think back to the first one we talked about where you're just focusing on the first letter of the words. And it will improve memory recall of those specific items and the order in which they are, but beyond that, it doesn't actually confer much information about those items. And this is because it reduces time overall that people spend looking for additional information or other information that ties this material either together or to other existing knowledge. Because you don't really need to know anything about parentheses or exponents or division or multiplication in order to understand PEMDAS requires that I write these 6 words out on a piece of paper. Further, it doesn't really help you with any type of meaning whatsoever, which is kind of what I was getting at with this parentheses comment. So the idea of King Philip crosses the ocean to find good spaghetti, I can say kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, great. But it doesn't really help me understand what the difference between order and class is, or why order is a subset of class and not the other way around. Same for any of the other ones. So they work really well if you need to just remember a list of things, but they're fairly unhelpful when it comes to understanding anything about the why or what those things actually are and how they're related to the world or each other. Now, a lot of what we actually want to remember tends to be more complex material, everything from, say, previous events that happened to a friend that you need to talk about all the way to the material you learn in a psych class, for example. And so the more complex the material tends to be, the less mnemonics are going to serve. And so the better an individual is actually served by spending time focusing on the underlying meaning and relationships of that material. So the more one focuses on that underlying meaning, the more connections one builds, not only between the various pieces of information, tying them together, but also then tying that information to sort of one's already existing knowledge structure. And the more rich that set of connections is, the easier it is to remember all of the various different topics that oftentimes get covered in complex material. And the greater the degree of understanding about the material, the easier it is to remember. And again, this is tied hand in hand with connections. Oftentimes, the greater our understanding of something, the more interconnections we have just within the concepts of that material itself and of those concepts to our existing knowledge. So a good example of this, which of course loses a little bit of its pizzazz in this online format, but take these digits for example. Now, if I was to say, okay, you have 15 seconds to memorize all of these digits, would you be able to? What if it was 10 seconds, right? Does 149162536496481. And now, if you only tried to memorize the numbers, even if you chunk them together, it would be a fairly difficult task. But as soon as you understand the relationship between all of these numbers, you can just call them into your mind whenever you need to because you understand the operation that leads to these numbers. And these numbers are actually the first 9 digits squared, right? 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, and so on. And so now you don't even actually have to remember these, you just understand how they're generated. In the same way, the more richly you understand material that you're covering in complex topics, things like psychology, mathematics, chemistry, history, philosophy, I mean, any of these really, the more understanding you have, the easier it will be to remember the various items that you're trying to remember. The more you spend time just focusing on memorization, the easier it will be actually to lose nuanced information about it and the more difficult it will be to actually answer questions that require some thought or activity with that material. On that note, our existing knowledge makes a huge difference on how easy or difficult it is to learn or remember new material. Now, this is also just related to this idea of the amount of connections you can form. When you are an expert at something, you have a large existing knowledge base about whatever that thing is you're an expert in, and so when you learn something new, you have lots of spaces to make new connections. Whereas when you're learning something new, you don't have much existing knowledge in which to put it or ground it, and thus there is a limit on how many connections you can make. Excuse me. And so ultimately, this is seen actually across the board, where the more someone knows something about any kind of topic, the easier it is for them to learn new information. This is why sports fans can learn new sports facts at the blink of an eye, basically. You can throw and load them up with all kinds of new facts about their current teams and whatnot, and they will have no trouble remembering them. Similarly, for someone who studies cognitive psychology as their life, and that's what they've done for the last 20 years, when you tell them some new piece of information around cognitive psychology, it will not be very difficult for them to incorporate it. Excuse me. So, on the other side of this, please be gentle with yourselves, especially when you're learning something new, because it will take time in order to build up that degree of knowledge to facilitate the creation of connections that will make it easier and easier to remember. Now, one way around this, of course, is that you focus tremendously on this new material and relating it to other different types of things that you know, because that will again make it easier to remember. But just on average, it will be harder to learn new things when you are a novice than when you are an expert. Basically, it will get easier and easier to learn new things so long as you keep learning about a topic. And on that note, it is generally not very helpful if you are a novice and you compare your performance to an expert. It's just an unfair comparison and can often be disheartening.